for a few weeks now the history between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament. And we've talked about the fact that at the close of the Old Testament, the Persian Empire is the one that is predominant in the part of the world where biblical events are taking place. And we've talked about the fact that in the 330s AD, Alexander the Great, who came from Macedonia, the northern part of the Greek peninsula, leads the Greek conquest of the ancient world, overthrows the Persian Empire, and begins a domination by the Greek culture that will last right down until just a few decades before the New Testament opens, and introduces with his conquest not only the domination of Greek rule, but a whole lot more than that, specifically the language and the culture of the Greeks that comes with him. So tonight we're going to continue that study. We had looked last time essentially at the 11-year campaign of Alexander, and talked just very briefly at the end of class about the fact that upon Alexander's death, the kingdom divided into essentially four parts. You had Macedonia, you had Thrace, then you had Egypt, and then there was everything else, okay, which consisted essentially of, from Palestine west, most of what had been the old Assyrian Empire. And after that, the Babylonian Empire. And after that, the Persian Empire. And so you have pretty much everything that is north of the Arabian Desert and east as far as India. Okay? Initially, that's controlled by a man named Antigonus, but he became quite powerful to the point that he got to worrying the other Greek generals who were controlling the rest of the empire, and so they teamed up on him and more or less displaced him, and in his place rose to power a man by the name of Seleucus, who had been a leader of the army of Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy was the one who had taken up rule in Egypt. Now, you don't have to remember all those names, but for purposes of our story, there are two names that I want you to remember, and those are the names of Ptolemy and Seleucus. Ptolemy is the original ruler of the Greek Empire in Egypt. But after him, pretty much all the male leaders of his dynasty also took the name Ptolemy. Now, they might also be distinguished by some other surname that lets you know that this is a different Ptolemy than the previous Ptolemy. But there are lots and lots of Ptolemies. There's a whole line of Ptolemies. And then there were about 3 different names that the female rulers during this dynasty also took up. Probably the best known to most of us in this room is the name Cleopatra. Legendary, of course, for dealings with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. There were actually 7 Cleopatras during this dynasty. They had the Greeks in particular, but also leaders in this part of the world and in this time had a great affinity for passing the same name down. Sort of like prior to the Ptolemies, the Egyptian leaders had been known for centuries as what? Pharaoh. And it was one Pharaoh after another Pharaoh after another Pharaoh, right? Sort of the same idea. All right. Now, so you're going to be dealing in Egypt with Ptolemies, and primarily Ptolemies, and a little later on some Cleopatras. Okay. Over on the Asian side of things, you're going to be dealing with the Seleucids, and you're really going to be dealing with 2 names that more or less alternate. You're going to have Seleucus, and you're going to have Antiochus, or Antiochus, depending on how you pronounce it. And typically what you had was a Seleucus would have a son and would name his son Antiochus, and an Antiochus would have a son and would name his son Seleucus, who would in turn have an Antiochus, and so on and so forth. And so if that confuses you, there are going to be a bunch of them. We'll try to put Roman numerals after their name and maybe distinguish them in other ways. But essentially these are, in very, very, very brief format, the 2 dynasties that we're dealing with. Now, the reason these are the 2 dynasties that we're dealing with is because, geographically speaking, Palestine is located essentially right between the areas that these 2 dynasties control. Okay? Now, let's talk for a moment about the Seleucids, because their area of control, often when we're telling this story, centers in and around Antioch. And that's probably a misleading picture. Not probably, that is a misleading picture. They controlled everything from essentially the Mediterranean Sea eastward all the way to India, okay? Which means most of the old Persian Empire and the great cities of the Persian Empire, which means that their kings typically didn't hang out around Judea. In fact, most of them spent most of their time in what we know in the Old Testament as Shushan, or Susa, which was the city where the entire book of Esther takes place. Okay, far to the east of the land that we're worried about, even farther east than Babylon. Okay, but they're controlling all of this land, and they're having to deal with that because the more land you control, the more people you have to deal with in terms of trying to rule them, to control them, to deal with uprisings and one thing and another. They were constantly having to police the borders because, of course, the Indians were pushing to the west, and they were dealing off and on with the Indians to their east, with treaties and various different things of that nature. To the north, you have some very, very rugged country, and you had a number of smaller kingdoms that would rebel and try to break free, and they'd have to go and try to put down a rebellion and bring them back in. So there's a huge administrative nightmare of trying to administer this Seleucid Empire that is much, much bigger than just what's going on in Judea. But for purposes of our story, we tend to focus on Judea and sort of overlook what's going on in the rest of the empire. And I think maybe that gives us a little bit of tunnel vision to the point that it may inhibit our understanding of what actually happened. Because what's going on from the perspective of the Seleucids is, number one, they want to keep all of the territory and control that they have obtained. And number two, they want to expand it. And they're really not looking, as best we can tell from the records that we have, to expand east. And there's really nothing apparent to be gained by expanding to the north, because it's very rugged territory and very sparsely populated. And there's really nothing to be gained by expanding to the south, because in the Arabian Peninsula you have desert, and everywhere else you have sea. So there's really nowhere to expand to the south, which means the only place that they can legitimately expand is westward. Only there's a problem. What's west of all of this? I wish I had a map. I left my computer at home. I'm sorry. I intended to put you a map up here. But what's to the east of all of this? Anybody remember? I said east. What's west? What's west? I'm sorry.
Egypt and Greece.
That's it. Northern Africa and Southern Europe. Well, those are already populated. Northern Africa is Egypt. It's populated and controlled by the Ptolemies, so if you're going to expand there, you're going to have to deal with them. If you go for Southern Europe, you're going to have to deal, first of all, with Greece, and I think somebody said that, which means you're going to have to deal with your erstwhile allies in Thrace and Macedonia, and then in Achaia, which is the Greek peninsula proper, where Athens and Corinth and those cities are. You're going to have to deal with that. But also, all the while that this is going on, there's another power that's growing to the west. What's that power? Rome, yeah. We tend to think, I think, sometimes of the world powers as being a succession. One came on the scene after another, and it's really not that way at all. They overlap tremendously. And so while all of this history is going on, a lot of the Roman history that you know but maybe didn't realize it overlapped is also going on. For example, the wars with Hannibal are going on during a lot of the drama that's going on in the Seleucid Empire during this time. You remember Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who ended up marching, wasn't it an army including cavalry of elephants over the Swiss Alps and down to invade Italy from the north?
Far, by the way.
Sir?
Once he hit the Swiss Alps, he didn't march very north.
Right, yeah, elephants and Swiss Alps don't mix very well. But yeah, he attempted to invade Italy from the north. Interesting idea, didn't work, but Yeah, so all of that's going on. And so if they're going to advance to the west, they've got some real issues. But they're also Greek in culture. And so the idea of controlling areas like Thrace, Macedonia, Achaia are very tempting ideas. Because that's like saying we can annex the motherland. And that's effectively what they tried to do several times over. And really never succeeded. And in fact, the last time they really seriously tried it, they ran into the Romans, and it was disastrous for them, and it ultimately led to the death of the Seleucid Empire. And finally, it was the Romans who took them over. We'll get there a little bit later on, but I just want to paint that picture for you. Meanwhile, down in Egypt, Egypt is fairly geographically isolated, if you think about it. To the north, you've got the Mediterranean Sea, so to get there, you've got to come across water. To the south, you've got the Sahara Desert. To the west, you have the Sahara Desert. To the east, you've got the Sinai Peninsula and then the Arabian Desert. And so to get there, there are really only a few ways you can get there, and so they're somewhat isolated. And for a long time, they pretty well didn't have a lot of difficulty with the actual land of Egypt controlling that. Add to that the fact that when Alexander took control of Egypt, Egypt was fabulously wealthy. Egypt had been fabulously wealthy for centuries, and it was, bar none, the wealthiest part of the empire for at least the early part of the split. It was well supplied with wealth, and it was isolated, and so it was fairly easy to defend. And for several years, the Ptolemies enjoyed a pretty well, more or less unchallenged, at least not seriously challenged, rule of Egypt itself. Where the challenges came into play were when they expanded out of Egypt. And that's where our story comes into the picture. Because early on, the Ptolemies controlled Palestine. Now, remember, we have essentially three major settlements, three major focuses of settlement of Jews at this time in history. You have the Jews in Babylon who stayed there and continued to grow and develop there after the Babylonian captivity. You have the Jews in Palestine who had relocated there upon the Edict of Cyrus and had begun to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the society there in Palestine. And then you had a rather large population of Jews down in Egypt itself. And Alexandria in particular had a large population of Jews. Now you had Jews scattered all over and would increasingly have Jews scattered all over. But you had these three large locations of Jews. Okay? So you have Jews down in Egypt proper, and you have the Ptolemies controlling Palestine, which means two of the major population locations of Jews are controlled by the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies were, on the whole, pretty friendly toward the Jews. They, for the most part, continued to extend the same policies toward the Jews that Alexander had extended, which meant that they were allowed to continue to practice their religion more or less unmolested. They were allowed within limits to practice self-rule. They weren't disturbed a great deal. They were subject to Greek power. They were certainly required to pay taxes to their Greek overlords. They were required, if the call came, to answer and supply soldiers or workers for a major civic project, things of that nature. But on the whole, they were more or less left alone and allowed to rule themselves and worship as they pleased. And it was a fairly quiet time for the Jews, or at least it seems so from the records we have, because we just don't read about a whole lot of drama going on during this period. However, to the north and east, the Seleucids are growing, and they're looking for ways to expand. That's especially true about 221, when a man by the name of Antiochus III, who's also known as Antiochus the Great, comes to power. His goal is to restore the glory of the Seleucid Empire, which during the reign of his father had sort of fallen into disrepair. When I say it had fallen into disrepair, India had taken back a big chunk of land to the east, and 2 or 3 little kingdoms to the north and east had split off and formed their own little kingdoms. And so you had a lot of problems, and the kingdom appeared to be losing its grasp on its area of control. He wants to seize power, he wants to solidify power, and he wants to expand power. Okay? So he is going to institute several campaigns, one of which is against the Ptolemies. Why? Because about this time, Ptolemy III has died, and his son, Ptolemy IV Philopater, comes to the throne. Ptolemy IV is a weak king. He's young. He's not especially adept at administration. He's not an especially good, at least doesn't appear to be an especially good military leader. And Antiochus thinks this is a prime time to jump in on a weak, inexperienced young leader and take control of some prime territory for the glory of the Seleucid Empire, and also get a hold of a fairly lucrative hunk of land. Now, let's talk about that just a moment. We said a moment ago that Egypt itself is fabulously wealthy, and it was. But in addition to that, whoever controls Palestine controls some very lucrative territory. We've talked about this before. You have a major trade route that runs through Palestine. If you control the trade route, you can pass taxes and tariffs and things of that nature. The coast of Palestine is the home of the Phoenicians. What are the Phoenicians known for?
Sea
Trade. Seagoing trade over the Mediterranean. And so you have a number of port cities up and down the coast of the Mediterranean in Palestine. And if you control those port cities, you control the seagoing trade. Very, very lucrative location to control. And so if they can get a hold of that, they've got a pretty substantial prize. If they can actually get control of Egypt itself, they've got a very wealthy prize. Now, think back a moment to something we've said several times in our study. Every major world empire, beginning with the Assyrians, has foundered on the rock of Egypt. The Assyrians tried to control Egypt. It stretched them too thin. It set them up to fall. The Babylonians tried to control Egypt to a lesser extent. They fell to the Persians. The Persians tried to control Egypt. It stretched them too thin. They fell. And now the Seleucids are trying the same old trick. It's going to be a factor in their ultimate downfall. And in this particular little battle in 221, Ptolemy actually fights off Antiochus and wins the battle. But have you ever heard the old saying, lose the battle and win the war? That's effectively what Antiochus did. He lost that battle. But that battle sort of marks the beginning of the decline of the Ptolemies. And it isn't going to be very long until his son Antiochus IV is going to take over most of that territory, at least the Palestinian territory, if not Egypt proper. Now, we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Let's talk for the time we have left, though, about what's going on with the Jews while all of this is going on between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Several things. Number one, they're caught in the middle in these conflicts between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And there are a number of such battles, and here are the Jews geographically located right in the middle of the territory that joins these two. So they're stuck with all of the battles and the aftermath and all of that sort of stuff. Secondly, and I could not, I don't think, possibly overstate the importance of this, cultural Hellenization is making a huge, huge wave in Jewish society. Now here's what I mean by that. When Alexander came into this part of the world, remember I said that he marched not only with armies, but with an entire group of philosophers and scientists and thinkers and teachers and linguists and things of that nature. He wasn't just interested in military conquest. He was also interested in spreading the Greek culture and knowledge because he thought very highly of it. And he was very, very effective in doing that. He took the Greek language throughout his empire, which turns out to be a very fortuitous thing, but he also takes with it Greek culture. Now, Greek culture and Jewish culture mixed about as well as oil and water. And there were a number of reasons for that. Number one, obviously, there's the conflict between the ideas of deity. The Jews say there is one God, Jehovah God. The Greeks say there's an entire pantheon of gods. Secondly, there's a major conflict of what you might call worldview, philosophy of life. The Jews are a very modest people. Their religion teaches them modesty, moderation, a certain amount of decorum, I guess for lack of a better word, decency. The Greeks were, by comparison, a very mercurial people, a very hedonistic type people. In other words, they were, compared to the Jews, very preoccupied with satisfying the desires of the flesh. One of the things that was a favorite pastime of the Greeks was sports. Well, you say, what's wrong with that? Well, when the Greeks did sports, it wasn't exactly like turning on NFL. For starters, there were no uniforms, if you catch my drift. Greek sports were participated in the nude, as a general rule. This was a great scandal to the Jews. However, as time went on, and this Greek thinking pervaded the area, more and more Jews, and you can almost picture this, can't you, over the generations? The young Jews say, hey, those Greeks seem like pretty cool people. You know, and they start emulating some of their activities, and mom and dad are like, you can't do that, that's horrible. Yeah, and you know, they grow up and they have a little bit more lax views toward the Greek ideas than mom and daddy did. And their children perhaps have a little bit more lax views until at some point they are building a gymnasium in the middle of Jerusalem. And you say, what's wrong with that? I go to the gym every morning. You go to the gym wearing clothes. They did not. Okay? That was one major problem. But there were a number of Hellenistic thoughts and ideas that simply did not mix well with the Jewish way of looking at things, a lot of which was based in and around the teachings of the law of Moses. Not all of it. A lot of it also had to do with the traditions of the elders. But it didn't mix well, and there's a major cultural conflict. Now, most of us are old enough that we have lived through the American culture wars. And we've seen just in America how much disagreement and how vehement the disagreement has been between different outlooks on life right here in our backyard. Multiply that by about 5 is probably what we're looking at with the Greeks and the Jews. And this creeping Hellenization into Jewish life is creating factions among the Jews. Now, you have your conservatives and you have your liberals. They didn't call them that. They called them Pharisees and Sadducees, but that's essentially what they became. The Sadducees, by and large, were a pro-Greek outlook group. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were a very conservative, let's go back and keep ourselves separate and sanctified and holy under the law of Moses. In fact, the word that they used for themselves, the Hasidim, meant the separated ones. Okay? And so you have this culture war going on with Hellenization. You also have the influence of the diaspora. The diaspora is another word for dispersion. Remember I said you had 3 major population centers of Jews, but you have Jews that are spread throughout the Greek Empire, and more so as time goes on. To the point that by the time Paul is going on his missionary journeys, almost every city that he goes into, the first place he goes to preach is the synagogue. Even though we're talking about cities in Asia Minor, we're talking about cities on the Greek Peninsula, these cities all have synagogues because they all have a fairly large collection of Jews. And that's because Jews are spreading throughout the empire. Jews, during this time, have begun to acquire a reputation for being very adept at business. And they, by and large, earned that reputation. They are pretty good at business. And so as they spread throughout the empire, they do it successfully in business. And so you have this diaspora. Well, as they disperse, they naturally come into contact with ideas that are different and foreign to the ideas of the elders. And so you have these folks writing back home or coming back home to visit and bringing with them ideas that don't exactly fit with the very conservative old ideas of the elders. So the influence of the diaspora becomes an issue. And then you have a linguistic shift. I don't know that I could overestimate the importance of the linguistic shift, but let's talk about it a little bit. First and foremost, Alexander brings the Greek language with him as he conquers. What he ends up doing is giving the world, or at least that part of the ancient world, a universal language. And so while each geographical area kept their more or less native tongues, they became bilingual. And so even though you might be in Jerusalem and you might have grown up speaking Aramaic, and that's the language you speak at home, you've learned Greek, which means that you can speak to the Roman soldiers who just got off the boat from Italy. And it also means that you can speak to the Bactrian who is following a caravan down to Egypt on the trade route. And it also means that the folks from over in Susa who have come down the trade route as well also speak Greek, and you can converse with one another and you can do business with one another. And so the ancient world has a universal language, as far as we know, for the first time, certainly on this kind of a geographical scale. Now, that's important for a number of reasons. The first one that probably popped in all of your heads is, what language is the New Testament written in? Greek. Yeah. It gives us a language that makes it very easy for the New Testament church to go and spread the gospel throughout the ancient world because everybody speaks this language. All right? It also gives us a language that allows a very free exchange of ideas. And so for the first time, probably ever, the freedom of exchange of ideas that's coming into what otherwise was a pretty backwater part of the world is changing things. Now, the older ones of us in this room can remember that globalization in our lifetimes has made a major difference in the world that we live in. The world we live in today, in a lot of ways, is much smaller than it was when I was a child. In the sense that people are much more easily able to communicate interpersonally. When I was a child, the idea of sitting down at a computer and conversing with someone in Southeast Asia, while the computer simultaneously translated our languages back and forth, so that it really didn't matter that they didn't speak English and I didn't speak Laotian or something. And the idea that we could converse like that, it just wasn't thought of. Times have changed tremendously just in our lifetime. Well, imagine something like that going on in Palestine with this new language, and the fact that you have, even though you have 4 kingdoms, they're all Greek kingdoms that control most of the ancient world and the shipping and the trading and the people moving about from place to place, and the government. Ideas are flowing in a way that they never have before. And so they're flowing through this language. And so you've got this linguistic shift. Now, add another layer, and an unrelated layer, sort of. The Jews of the Old Testament prior to Daniel, the book of Daniel, speak Old Testament Hebrew. They write Old Testament Hebrew. But during the Babylonian captivity, the language of ordinary speech begins to shift from Old Testament Hebrew to Aramaic. Now, it didn't happen overnight. It happened over a number of years. But by the time we get to the New Testament, the spoken language of the ordinary person in Palestine is not Old Testament Hebrew. It's Aramaic. Now, Aramaic is a kindred language, but it's not the same. And an Aramaic speaker would not be able to simply pick up an Old Testament Hebrew Bible and read it fluently, at least not quite so fluently. think of it this way. You all know that French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese all descended from Latin, right? If you grow up speaking French, you might be able to pick up an Italian newspaper and make some sense out of it, but it's not going to flow, and you're not going to have intimate knowledge of the language unless you've studied it pretty deeply. And there are going to be a lot of things, little shades of meaning, little connotations and things of that nature that probably will pass you by entirely, because even though you might be able to make the general flow of the language, you're not fluid in that language, okay? Something analogous to that would be the normal speaker of Aramaic trying to pick up the Old Testament and read it in the Old Hebrew. Now that's probably not an exact fit, but it will at least describe the idea to you. And so you've got these rabbis who are teaching in Sabbath school and synagogue school the Old Testament, and they're trying to get the people to learn, but increasingly as the people speak Hebrew less and less, they're depending more and more on the rabbis to explain to them what this language that is becoming more and more foreign to them actually means. Now, historically speaking, what happens when, I'm going to use these terms because you'll understand what I mean. I know that they're not biblically correct, but what happens when the laity depends on the clergy to tell them what the deity has said, historically speaking?
No, abuse power.
Yeah. Abuse, right? Essentially, over and over and over, we've seen it. Well, you begin to see some of that beginning to creep up as well. And you begin to see these traditions of the elders. And if I want to teach you something authoritatively, the way I'm going to do so is I'm going to give you the pedigree of rabbis who have taught this doctrine, rather than point you to book, chapter, and verse in the law of Moses. Does that make sense? So you have all of this stuff going on in the Jewish culture. All the while, you've got these two empires on either side of them vying for power. And Lord willing, next week, we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into these two guys, and specifically this one, and his forays into the life of the average Jew. Hope this has been helpful to you. Do you have questions or comments? Thank you so much for your attention.